Hi there everyone. Okay, so in this very quick tutorial we're going to be having a look at how to build a realistic camera rig for our scenes inside of Maya. Now these kind of camera setups are also referred to as multi-node cameras and involve splitting up the rotation and translate channels into different groups that we can then label under the terminology that's used for them in real life. For example, track, dolly, pan, roll and tilt. Now, the reason that we might want to set up our cameras like this is that it's going to allow us to animate the scenes far quicker. It's going to make our edits of those animations cleaner, and it'll also encourage you to think more about the real world when you're positioning your camera. So you're going to think in more cinematic terms, which in the end is going to give you a far better result inside of your animations. Now, before we get into actually setting up a rig, I want to show you what happens when you animate a standard camera in Maya across lots of different channels, okay? So if I go ahead and create a standard camera, and then I animate it moving up and down. So if I was to set a key on the translate Y at frame 1, and then go to frame 24 and move that up and key it again, we now have our camera moving up and down. So that's fine. However, say for example, halfway through, I want it to rotate in the Y, like so. So now, we've got it moving up and down and then rotating halfway through. Now while this looks alright, what you can sometimes find is that on far more complex animations, when you render that image out, you're going to get a little bit of a jitter inside the camera, okay? And this is to do with the fact that we have animation on multiple channels across the one object. And the other reason is, if I was to open up the graph editor for this, you can see that we now have two curves on the same object. Now, that doesn't look too complicated at the moment, but imagine you have a frame sequence of 800 frames, and you have a very complex camera move, so you're having to deal and edit all the different channels at the one time. While we can select these out and highlight them, it's still going to be far easier for us and far quicker if they're already split up for us in different nodes and groups. Okay, so I'm going to close this down, and we're now going to have a look at how to set this camera up. So I'll delete this one, and I'm going to hide the scene that I've got, and I'm going to go ahead and create myself a brand new camera. Now the first thing that I'm going to do before I do anything else with this is I'm going to rename this. So I'm going to double click on that, and I'm going to call it Camera Master. Okay, so that's the master camera in our scene, and that doesn't get touched. The idea is that when we finish this rig, even though the camera itself will be higher up and we can move it around, we will not have any values on this camera here. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control G to group the camera to itself. I'm going to call this Scale, and then I'm going to scale the camera up uniformly 2.5 units. And now, if I was to open up this group and click on the camera itself, you'll notice that I don't have a change in the scale on the camera itself. It's all happening on the group above it. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through this, okay? Hierarchies in Maya are very, very useful things to implement into your workflow. It's just sometimes, if you've never used them before, they can be a little bit tricky to get your head around. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the different controls we've got with our camera. So in rotate mode, if I was to rotate the camera left and right in the Z axis, this is actually called rolling the camera. Okay? If I was to rotate it back and forth in the X axis, we're tilting down and we're tilting up the way. In the Y axis, we're panning left and right. Okay? When we're moving the camera back and forth, or left and right, this is known as dollying in and dollying out, or we're tracking left and we're tracking right. So we now need to set all of this up into different groups. Okay, so the first thing I want to do with this scale group is group it again, and that's just by hitting Control G on the keyboard. And I'm going to start with the pan control. So if I go into my rotate mode, I know that the pan is the rotate Y, so I'll double click on my group, rename it pan underscore Y axis, and that's just to remind me that that's the axis it's going to be rotating in. And then I'm going to group it again, and this time we're going to look at the roll. So we'll double click on that, name it roll, Z-axis. There we go. And we'll hit group one more time, and we'll do the tilt, which is the X-axis. Whichever order you want to put them in is absolutely fine. That's just the ones I've chosen for this moment. So there we go. That's our camera now set up for its different rotations. Now the next thing we need to do is set up the tracking and the dollying. So I'm going to group the camera one more time, and I'm going to call it track_dolly. We can now dolly in and out and track left and right. So the next thing we have to do with the camera is more of a visual cue. We're going to set it up as though the camera actually has an invisible tripod. Alright, so we're going to raise the camera up a little bit. So to do that, I'm going to group the camera one more time, and I'm going to call this render cam. And this is just what I call all of my cameras. That just lets me know that that's the camera that needs to be rendered through. And with that grouped, I'm going to move it 8 units in the Y, just so that it's sitting up like so. And now we're going to set up some controls for it. So I've got some curves here that I'm going to open up. So if I click on this layer here, I've already got these curves set up for me, just to save a little bit of time. But all these are edited CV curves that I've created into the shape of a few arrows. There is no need to actually create controls like this. You could simply use locators or standard NURB circles, or if you wanted, you could simply go in and grab each group individually and animate it that way. This is simply to make things a little bit easier. So we'll have a quick look through how to set this up. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to open up the controls group and then open up my render cam group. I'm going to start by selecting the pan control, then we'll hit control and click on the pan group. Then we're going to go to constraint, orient, and into the option box. I'm going to reset the settings, and then I'm going to turn on maintain offset, and I'm going to choose the Y-axis from the constraint axes section, and then just hit apply. I'll close that down, and you should see that the rotate Y of your pan axis group becomes blue. Now, when I grab the control and rotate it, the camera follows. And I've positioned the control roughly where the base of the tripod would be. Next, we're going to go to the tilt and do the same. So we'll select our tilt control, control click the tilt group, go to constraint, orient, options, and we'll choose the X-axis this time and hit apply. Make sure that works. It's always a good idea that anytime you're setting up controls in this way, is that once you've applied it, make sure that it is working, just in case you have to go back and fix it. Sometimes the way you've selected it isn't the order that you need to, sometimes it's the opposite, if that makes sense. So, the next thing we're going to do, we're going to select the roll, then control, right click the roll group, constrain, orient, options, and then choose the Z-axis and hit apply. So now we can have our pan, our roll, and our tilt. The next thing we need to do is we need to take the track and dolly control, then hit control and click the track dolly group, go to constrain, and this time we're going to go to parent, into the option box, and we're going to choose translate all and hit apply. So now when we move the control, the camera can dolly in and out and left and track left and right. Of course, the problem we have here is that our controls for this aren't actually following along. That's simple enough to fix. We'll just select them all in the outliner, middle mouse click, and drop them into the track dolly group. So now when we move, all the controls follow and they will all work independently. Okay, so there's one last thing that we need to look at, and that's actually locking down the controls. You'll notice there I accidentally rotated the control in the Z-axis. Now that's not doing anything. So if you were, for example, giving this to an animator to use, you would need to lock these off just so that they don't think the control can rotate in a way that it's not supposed to. So to do that, we're just going to grab one of the controls here for the roll, and I know that it can only move, or it should only move, in the rotate Z. So I'll use my left mouse and click and drag on these channels here, right click, and choose lock selected. And I'll do the same for the bottom, like so, and then I can repeat that for the other controls. So know that that's just the Y. Just lock those down. And last we'll do the tilt, which is the X, so we'll lock all the translates, and we'll lock the rest of the scale and the rotate channels. And there we go. So now, no matter what I do, I can only rotate each control the way that I want it to be rotated. And we can also set the track and dolly up the same way. If you wanted to, you can lock it down to just the X and the Z. However, in some instances, I will use the Y translate just to move the camera up and down if I was working with a basic rig like this. But you could of course make another group that was somewhere in the middle that allowed you to move the whole camera unit up or down. So there we go, that's how to set up a realistic or a multi-node camera rig. Hopefully it was useful, and thanks very much for listening.